Oliver Twist, Chapter 18. The Locket. On the same night that Oliver and Bill broke into the house, Mr. Brownlow made an important discovery. The old gentleman had sent a letter to the workhouse looking for information about Oliver's past. He expected another letter in return, but he received 2 visitors instead. Mr. and Mrs. Bumble arrived just after dinner. It was not often that the Bumbles visited a neighborhood or house as nice as Mr. Brownlow's. Both were dressed in their Sunday best, hoping to impress the gentleman. Mrs. Bedwin brought them into the study where Mr. Brownlow was reading the paper. "Mr. Brownlow, sir," Mr. Bumble said, "we came from the workhouse when we heard you were looking for help." Mr. Bumble held his hat in both his hands. He was worried that his hands might start to shake. Mr. Brownlow stood up to greet them. "So, you know Oliver Twist?" he asked. "Know Oliver Twist?" Mr. Bumble said proudly. "I am the one who gave him that name. We've known him all his life." Mrs. Bumble frowned at her husband's comments. "My husband means to say that we've been taking care of him all his life, feeding him and giving him clothes. It's a thankless task, but we do it." Mr. Brownlow saw right through Mrs. Bumble's remarks. He knew that she was not to be trusted. "And by feeding him, do you mean serving watered-down gruel 3 times a day?" Mr. Brownlow asked. "Am I to understand that you consider dirty rags to be clothes? That forcing children to work all day in a bottle-washing factory is taking care of them?" The old gentleman's voice was very harsh. "I didn't come all this way to be insulted," Mrs. Bumble said rudely. "I could leave right this minute if I wanted." "Of course you could," Mr. Brownlow said, "but I assume you have some information to sell or you wouldn't have come at all." "Well," Mr. Bumble interrupted. He tried to sound friendly to lighten the mood. "We do have something for you. If you saw it fit to pay us for our trouble and expense, we'd be grateful, of course." Mr. Bumble smiled. He thought of himself as very wise, even though everyone else thought him a fool. "Let me hear this news, then we can discuss payment," Mr. Brownlow replied. Mr. Bumble nudged his wife. She removed a piece of cloth from her pocket. "We didn't even know this existed until a few weeks ago," she said. "The old woman who was at Oliver's birth gave it to me just before she died." Mr. Bumble unwrapped the cloth. She held up a gold locket and chain. "Seems the boy's mother wanted Oliver to have this locket. It was the only thing she owned," Mrs. Bumble said. "The old woman decided to keep it for herself, though. I guess she felt guilty about it in the end. She wanted me to give it to Oliver, but he had run away by then." "Then not long after," Mr. Bumble said, "we received a letter from you looking for information." "That's very lucky indeed," Mr. Brownlow said quietly. "May I?" He took the locket from Mrs. Bumble. He slowly opened it up. Mr. Brownlow let out a long sigh when he saw the contents of the locket. He closed it again and shut his eyes. Mrs. Bumble interrupted this moment of silence. "And you know, it wasn't easy getting here," she said. "It's hard to leave work, and there is the expense of the coach into London." "You will be repaid for your troubles," Mr. Brownlow said. He called Mrs. Bedwin and asked her to see the Bumbles to the door. Mr. Brownlow gave them money to pay for the coach tickets and some extra as a reward. He was so distracted that he almost forgot to say thank you. The locket's contents shed new light on the Oliver Twist mystery. Mr. Brownlow could see the pieces coming together.